My wife's grandfather is from France and is full-blooded French. He grew up a long time ago, back in the early 1900s, in a very small village where they were plagued with the ROUGAROU. Fortunately, I had the chance to talk to him before he passed a few years ago and ask him all about the ROUGAROU that he personally encountered when he was younger. He was about 90-something when he passed about 4 or 5 years ago, and had a plethora of personal encounters with this same creature back when he was just a boy, somewhere between 10 and 13 years old. His brother, who was 17 at the time of his own personal encounter, was killed by this very creature. What's interesting is my wife's grandfather thought the notion of the Western culture werewolf, the transforming into a werewolf under a full moon, that was complete nonsense, and that these creatures were supposedly from hell, and that people didn't actually transform. They were just wild demonic beasts that would feast and ravage the flesh of the innocent that it could get its hands on around the village. He also claimed that many of the men attempting to protect the village had lost their lives to this beast, this monstrosity, leaving the village extremely vulnerable. Many women and children began disappearing. You gotta remember, this is like back in the 20s or 30s, in very rural France. They didn't exactly have the cavalry to call in. They were pretty much on their own. And he never told me the name of the village, but my wife had showed me at one point, and I think it's somewhere south or east of Paris, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember exactly. I'll have to have her show me again. She remembers. But something else that he told me that I found very interesting is that this thing only came around certain times. And no, it wasn't on a full moon. It was like a seasonal thing, or certain times of the year it would appear, and only at night. Sometimes snatching defenseless women walking home, or even children who strayed too far away from the protection of men with rifles or their parents, or even small animals. It was even common to find the bones of those victims that it had claimed in the woods just beyond the safety of the tiny village. And get this, here's the kicker, and they were able to trap it and kill it, Hollywood style. Somehow, a group of the men there who were guarding the village were able to trick it and lure it into an older barn, where they trapped it, set the barn ablaze, and killed it, apparently. After that, they had rid themselves of their ROUGAROU problem, and I guess that was the end of that, having casualties in the double digits, ranging from small animals to livestock to women and children, and even men. While many of our modern-day Western culture doesn't take it seriously in the least bit, it's interesting to know and hear from a first-hand account that these things are real, and that he has seen it several times himself. When he went on to describe it for me, he described it as being very tall, easily 9 to 10 feet. Bear with me here because he actually used the term meters because he's European, so I've tried to get a rough estimate of what he meant in feet. It resembled that of a very, very large gray wolf, except just standing upright, having large claws and hands like a person with opposable thumbs. He said the head and the snout were larger than they should have been, and the eyes were a fierce, glowing yellow. And the scariest part was this thing had the ability to telepathically speak to people. At least it spoke to him a couple of times, telling him that it was going to come after his family, kill him, and rip his throat out. Enough to terrify my wife's grandfather. In fact, many of the kids of the village would never play outside after the sun went down. This included every season, just out of fear. I guess this went on for about 5 or 6 years before this ROUGAROU was eventually caught and killed in that barn fire. The real mystery comes as to where it came from, who the ROUGAROU was, because at the time there was speculation it was somebody who kept transforming, but they quickly discarded that notion. As for myself, I've been a huge fan of creatures and cryptids like Bigfoot and all the likes for years and years. And so, I can't exactly remember how I got on the conversation with him, but I started talking to him about werewolves and Bigfoot, and even though he didn't acknowledge Bigfoot, he started talking to me about the ROUGAROU, and that he never mentions it because nobody really believes him. Even my wife doesn't take him too seriously. But I found his entire sets of accounts very, very fascinating. If you ever have any personal run-ins with the ROUGAROU, stay away. They are extremely violent and very hostile, and they will kill on sight. And before I conclude my email to you, no, silver bullets don't work. That's a Hollywood thing. As far as what he told me, the only way to truly kill a ROUGAROU is setting it on fire and killing it that way. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I live in a pretty small rural town in northern Colorado. Not much happens around here. Even more so because, well, I don't really have neighbors, and it's pretty quiet. A great place for me and my wife, and to have a small section of goats. Until recently, something has came and claimed most of my goats, tearing them to shreds, not leaving much of anything. In fact, they are so torn up, there's hardly even any meat left on them. I have no idea what kind of predator does this, but certainly not a mountain lion, nor a wolf or a coyote. They will usually always eat and feast on the cadaver. So, what could possibly be tearing my goats into pieces? It all started when I woke up one early morning, about 5 a.m., made my cup of coffee, and went out to go feed my goats. Well, all of them, every single one of them, was dead, strewn about in their pen, guts and blood, literally everywhere, coating the walls and all over the ground. The smell was even worse than the sight, and I completely vomited all over myself and the ground. After going back inside, telling my wife, and calling the police, although looking back, there's not a whole lot they could do, but I figure I would cover every measure that I could. I tried to figure out what would do this, and I wondered if it might be a bear, but I don't know if there's any bears up here, at least in this area. And again, what predator kills all these goats and doesn't bother to either A, drag back the cadaver to eat on, or even bother to eat on the cadaver in the first place? You could tell that none of these animals had even been eaten on. There were no teeth marks. It's like all of them were just thrown into a blender or a shredder and then strewn about everywhere. Something had just killed these goats for the sake of killing, and I'm not exactly sure what or why. Part of me thinks this was done by a person to maybe enact revenge, although for what, I'm not sure. I haven't done anything to anybody out here, and I've only kept to myself. I haven't even made any friends, let alone enemies. But that's the only thing I could think of, is that maybe somebody snuck onto my property during the nighttime and slaughtered each and every goat. But then again, what kind of person would rip apart goats and then just leave their guts all about, without leaving any sort of tracks or evidence of the tools they used? It just doesn't make any sense. The killings and the way everything was strewn about makes me think of some kind of animal. I just can't exactly pinpoint what kind of animal it would be. That's why ultimately I'm messaging you. You seem to be an expert in the subject, so I'm hoping you can help me with my dilemma. A few years ago, I used to live in Illinois for quite some time. About 7 years, roughly, pursuing a dead-end career that I'm glad I got out of. I lived in a heavy agricultural area, so not an urban environment like many people would like to believe Illinois is. The area in which I lived in had lots and lots of corn, and if you've ever lived in or been in the Midwest, you would know that corn and grain is a huge market out here. But that's besides my point. I remember I heard stories about large upright wolf creatures living in the cornfields. That's when I first moved in, and I thought it was a joke, until I began hearing more and more about it. Well, there was a large cornfield not far away from where I lived, and several times, driving back at night, I could have swore that I saw the silhouette and shapes myself of a large upright walking canine going through the corn. One time, even staring at my vehicle as my headlights hit it, its red eyes glowing as it passed. As you can imagine, this scared me beyond my wits. but I maintained composure and didn't lose grip of the wheel or crash the vehicle. This thing just quickly ran by my car, across the road, from one cornfield to another. Then, another night, about 4 nights after this one, I think, I saw it again, just emerging out of the cornfield. And that's when I got a much better look at this thing that supposedly was a werewolf that everybody was talking about. While I don't believe in the idea of werewolves, this thing resembled just that. In fact, it looked like it stepped right outside of a Hollywood movie set. Taller than my vehicle, which I drive a truck, so this thing was easily 9 feet tall. Bulkier than a linebacker on a football team, and a massive, massive head. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Dog Soldiers, this thing resembles one of the creatures from that movie. Not entirely, but somewhat close. More so the head, how it is just so incredibly bulky and large, and very evil looking. This thing emerged from the corn just as I was driving by, like it was waiting for me to pass by so it could watch my vehicle go by. As soon as I passed it, I was kind of in shock to see it again for the second time in just a few short days. I looked back in my rearview mirror, and it didn't appear to be anywhere. So I don't know if it disappeared, darted across the road like a few nights prior, or just went back into the corn. I'm not exactly sure. But those are the only 2 times that I ever saw this creature. Afterwards, I would still be in Illinois for about another few years, but I had never seen this creature again. Even though I was living in that area, I had continuously heard stories about them stalking people, killing prey and animals, and even potentially hurting people, but never anything more than that. After a while, I kind of just stopped paying attention to the stories altogether and minded my own business. One of the reasons I'm happy to be out of that state